Okay, welcome back to another Wednesday webinar. I'm Shannon Dill. I'm with University of Maryland Extension and part of the Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture programs. We have these webinars the second and fourth Wednesday of every month and are happy today to have Kay Megan Washington with Maryland Agricultural Conflict Resolution Service with us today to talk about communicating on difficult topics with difficult people. We are recording this session and they're available, all of our recordings are available at the website there in blue, extension.umd.edu/women-in-ag. And we also have our upcoming webinars that are posted on there as well. We'd also like to thank our sponsors as well as the collaborators on this program. So with that, I am going to go to our slides and turn it over to Kay Megan.
Thanks, Shannon. What a great introduction. Hopefully I can live up to it. Hi, as Shannon said, I'm Kay Megan Washington, and I'm the current program administrator for the Agricultural Conflict Resolution Service through the Maryland Department of Agriculture. A lot of you may not be familiar with the program if you haven't had to use us, but we are the USDA certified agricultural mediation program for the state of Maryland, and we work to help our Maryland farmers deal with situations of conflict or dispute that can frequently come up with creditors or vendors or non-farming neighbors, or even within families with regard to things like estate planning and succession of the business and things along those lines. And I'll talk some more about that towards the end. But a lot of what is covered in those things involves having to communicate with people about topics that you may find difficult, or with people who are difficult in and of themselves. So I thought that that was something that it might be helpful to talk to people about. Since as human beings, we tend not to know how to deal with conflict effectively just instinctively. It's something that we tend to avoid. And most of that is because we tend to think of conflict as something that is negative and something that makes us uncomfortable. And so when things make us uncomfortable, we tend to shy away from them. And particularly as women, we're often trained to try to stay away from conflict and to not be confrontational. So I thought this might be something that would be helpful to folks. So this is just a brief roadmap here for today's presentation. I'll be talking a little bit about what conflict is, the definition of conflict, how we tend to perceive conflict, and how our perceptions tend to impact the way that we deal with it. We'll be talking about communication skills. So just in general, what are things that we can use to communicate more effectively and that can help us to get the things that we want and that we need from other people. And then also some concrete tips to make discussions easier. There are always going to be some things that are going to be difficult to talk about, but these will hopefully help you to make those discussions a little bit easier and a little bit more productive and effective. So let's start off with what is conflict. We can start that actually, I mean, you can even just look in the dictionary, which I did, and look at some of the words that are down as synonyms for conflict. Anger, disagreement, discord, fighting, clash, dispute, war, collision. Given those sorts of words, all of those have a sort of a negative implication to them. Of course, this would be something that we would try to avoid as much as possible. It tends to bring up a lot of strong feelings in us, frequently enough fear, and with fear tends to come, you know, our typical fight or flight reflex. You know, either you try to get away from it as quickly as possible, or you jump in and try to confront it and fight it. But it's very rarely something that we are able to deal with in a calm and neutral sort of manner without a lot of practice and training. So that's part of what this is about. So there are 5 typical styles. 4 of them are much more common than the other ones. There are people who tend to accommodate in a conflict situation. So those are the people who will say whatever you want. They want to get out of it as quickly as possible. So, hey, whatever you want, other person, I will go with that. Someone who avoids conflict won't even take the time to engage enough to accommodate. They'll just try to stay away from it as much as possible. Those who compete, you saw a perfect example of 2 people competing in a conflict situation right there in that video. Those were 2 people where one of them could have dropped it if Lois, the one who was initially in the car and was hit with the car door, if she had simply said, well, I'm sure she didn't mean to, and driven off, then that would have been the end of the situation. But she couldn't drop it, and neither could the other woman, and they ended up with 2 completely wrecked cars. Compromise, that's what we are told that we're supposed to work towards. You give a little and the other person gives a little, and you'll meet somewhere in the middle. Now, what we typically find, unfortunately, is that compromise really isn't terribly effective because nobody ends up happy. Everybody feels like they gave up more than the other person, and it feels like a lose-lose situation rather than a win-win. And then the last one, which is relatively rare unless you really work towards it, is collaboration. So working productively with the person that you are in the dispute with in a way so that each of you can get the things that are most important to you. And a lot of that it takes a lot of work to figure all that out, because you have to figure out what is most important to you in this situation, and how can you work it out so that you get that and the other person can get the other thing as well. And that can be very difficult to do and is best done with good communication. By embracing conflict as part of life, as opposed to something negative that's to be avoided, you can make the most out of each situation. You can use it as a learning opportunity or a leadership opportunity. You can also use it as an opportunity to transform the situation into something better. If you think about it, you know, another word for conflict can be friction, and there are certainly situations where you need friction in order to get anywhere. If it's winter and you are on an ice-covered road, you need friction. You want friction in order to be able to move forward. So friction is something that can be used in a productive way, or it can be destructive. Now, there are, in fact, situations where each of these conflict styles is what you want to use in that situation, and determining the appropriate method to apply in a particular situation can result in the best possible solution. So if you look at this grid here, if you look over on the far left-hand side, the axis there goes from low to high, and it's the importance of the relationship. And then down at the bottom, again from low to high, we have the importance of the outcome. So how important is it to you to sustain your relationship with the person that you're in the dispute with? And how important is it to you to win in the dispute that you're involved in? So in a situation where the importance of the outcome is pretty low as far as you're concerned, but it's really important that you maintain your relationship with the person you're involved in, that's a situation where you might accommodate. Hey, honey, can we go out for Chinese food for dinner? I don't know, I had Chinese food for lunch. Well, you know what? That's okay. What would you like to eat? That's an accommodation. That's a situation where the relationship that you're in with that person is much more important than whether or not you eat Chinese food that particular day. You can eat Chinese food anytime you want to. Down at the bottom here You have a situation where the importance of the relationship is low and where the importance of the outcome is low. This is a situation where if those two women, for example, in that video had taken this tack, where the importance of the outcome was not that important, there wasn't that much damage to the door of the car, and they don't know each other. They're not friends. They're not co-workers. They don't have to ever see each other again. So they could have avoided that conflict entirely and just gone off in their specific ways. If the importance of the outcome is high and the importance of the relationship is low, well, then you compete. And that's what you had there in that video, where one person has to win and the other person has to lose. Now, in the middle here, you have compromise, where we both win and we both lose, right there in the middle. We both get a little bit of what we want and we both lose a certain amount of what we wanted. And then up here at the top, where the importance of the relationship is high and the importance of the outcome is high, you have collaboration, where you can both win. Now, what you have to figure out often enough is, which style do you most identify with? We don't often think about what our conflict management style is. But which one of these do you tend to be more comfortable with? Are you able to shift back and forth between different situations, or do you tend to stick with one? I'm the sort of person who, even though I have training in this, I tend to be conflict avoidant. I just don't like conflict. It makes my stomach hurt. I have to push myself to actually engage in dealing with conflict or in dispute situations in a productive way. It's something I've had to work towards. Just as important as which style you tend to use most, which style does the person you're dealing with seem to identify with? If you're an avoider and the other person is a competitor, you're going to end up in situations where you lose out pretty much all the time. And that's going to make you resentful and upset. So not a particularly productive way to deal with things. Moving forward here. So what are some sources of conflict? There are a lot of sources of conflict, but most boil down to either lack of knowledge or poor communication. So we tend to have a lot of differences over money. Things that involve money tend to make people very involved and very invested, so to speak, in winning in that situation. Differences over information. One person may have more or less information than the other one, or they may disagree as to the validity of that information. Their interests and goals may differ. They may have differences in how they think relationships should work. They may have differences in values or cultural norms. This is the way that I do it where I come from. This is the way that you do it where you come from, and I don't agree with the way that you do that. Or you can just have a personality clash. I'm sure all of us have run into people that we just didn't get along with. They just rubbed us the wrong way. And that can tend to make us more vulnerable to engaging in conflict with that person and in dealing with that conflict in less productive ways because we just don't like them very much. Conflict tends to move in a fairly predictable cycle. What tends to happen is, you'll notice there's an arrow here that runs through each of these steps and then comes back to the top. And that's why it's a cycle. It keeps going and it keeps sustaining itself and maintaining itself on its own energy. So you may have a stressful incident that happens. That causes you to feel a particular way or causes the other person to feel a particular way. They behave in a way that can be observed. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit because that's a little confusing. That behavior causes the other person to respond. That ups the level of stress, and then that continues to go. So going back to the video that we just saw, the stressful incident was that the woman in the next car opened her car door and banged and put a dent into the door of Lois's car. She felt that the woman had done that on purpose and was trying to get away with it. And so rather than just saying, ma'am, I don't know if you noticed, but you bumped my car, and allowing the woman to say, I'm sorry, she said, well, I don't know that I guess you thought that nobody was going to catch you at it, but you just hurt my car. You could at least say, I'm sorry. That, of course, is a really sort of, puts the other person on the defensive. And that was the behavior that that person observed. So she said, oh, well, she's just going to be offensive towards me. I'm going to be offensive back. Well, I don't see what the problem is. It's not like it's going to hurt your resale value. Well, now that ups the level of stress, because then Lois feels like she's saying, oh, what, I can't afford a nice car? Is that what you're saying? Are you talking about my choices here? And then it just sustains itself over and over. The important thing with the cycle of conflict is not to let it spin out of control the way it did in that video, but to find a place to intervene. Now, you can't necessarily intervene in terms of how you feel about things or how the other person responds, but you can definitely impact your own behavior right here. So, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's talk a little bit about communication skills just in general. The first thing to determine, and this is one of those things that we don't always think about very much, is what kind of an impression you make on other people. Now, I actually went to what was supposed to be a communication seminar not too long ago, and these were things that they listed as 15 essential people skills. And they asked us, which ones of these have you mastered? Well, I thought that sort of being self-aware and taking a look at that was interesting. But let's take a look at some of these essential people skills. Are you genuine? Are you patient? Are you empathetic? Are you polite? Are you respectful? Are you trustworthy? Are you a good listener? Are you flexible? Are you positive? Are you open-minded, articulate, honest, self-aware, good-humored, other-focused? Well, these are all very nice things. They're very positive things. They also tend, in general, to be things that women are more skilled at and are socialized to do. To be patient, to be polite, to be respectful, to be a good listener, to be open-minded, to be good-humored, to be focused on the other person. One of the things that I noticed seemed to be missing here, and you'll notice that was a question I asked, is being assertive. Going after what it is that you need, being clear, being not just open-minded about what the other person wants, but being open and honest about what it is that you want and what you need. But it is sort of interesting and useful, I think, to think about which of these skills you tend to be more skilled at and which ones do you struggle with. But let's talk a little bit more about assertive communication, because that's one of the things that's going to be really important in making sure that we are able to communicate clearly to other people what it is that we need and what we want, and to make it more likely that we will get that. So let's clarify a couple of terms here. So I have here written on the left passive, aggressive, and assertive. So passive communication tends to be a style where people avoid expressing their own opinions or their feelings. They don't really tend to protect their rights very much. They don't identify or get their needs met in overt sorts of ways. And they don't tend to respond openly or honestly to situations that hurt them or make them angry. They tend to let things sort of fester and allow their grievances and their annoyances to just build up, and they aren't necessarily aware that they're building up until there's that one last straw that breaks the camel's back, and then they tend to be vulnerable to explosive sorts of outbursts that are out of proportion to whatever the incident is that triggered it, which makes them feel guilty and ashamed and confused about where that came from, and so they tend to go back to being passive. Again, there are situations where passivity in communication may be your best bet, but it doesn't tend to work well as the only thing in your trick bag. Aggressive communication, on the other hand, is a style where people tend to express their feelings and opinions, and they do advocate for themselves, but they do it in a way that violates other people's rights and needs. They can often be verbally or even physically abusive. They try to dominate other people. They try to use humiliation to control other people. They criticize. They blame others. They tend to be very impulsive because they're feeling a lot of strong feelings and they feel like they need to fight. And they have a very low frustration tolerance. You got a lot of that aggressive communication in that video that we just saw. I had a feeling, and some of that comes from having watched the show, that Lois, the main person who started things, tends to be very aggressive in her communication style just in general. The other woman might not be, given the bumper sticker that's on her car, but that's where she went when that's where Lois went first. Now, you'll notice that one of the things that's not on this list is a term that you may have heard frequently, which is passive-aggressive. I don't tend to like that term a lot. Usually what people see as passive-aggressive is really just an angry, passive person. Because what most people mean when they say that someone is being passive-aggressive is that they're angry, but they're not being honest or open about the fact that they're being angry. And that tends to be seen as a way to try to manipulate people. I tend to think of it more as someone who is frightened of confrontation but who's been pushed to their limit and is afraid still of being open about the fact that they're angry but really feels like they need to get this out. And then, of course, we have assertive communication. This is what we want to work towards as much as possible. People who are assertive clearly state their opinions and feelings. They advocate for their rights and their needs without violating the rights of other people. So they don't tend to take advantage of other people, but they're not going to let other people take advantage of them either. They value themselves and their time, and they're strong advocates for themselves, but they're still very respectful of those things in other people. So that's where we want to focus. So there's some questions to ask yourself when you're communicating with others if what you're striving for is to be assertive. What do I want? What do they want? What does the other person want? If I don't know, how can I find out? What will get me what I want? And by that, I don't necessarily mean hitting someone or punching someone or being verbally or physically aggressive towards them or trying to be manipulative. What will get me what I want in a positive way? What's my hook? When I say the hook here, often enough what will get somebody involved in a productive conversation with you around something that you both have strong feelings about is to find something that is a common ground between you. So let's say that you have a child who has come back from ag school with their brand new degree, and they want to come in and they want to institute all sorts of new practices on your farm. And you're very happy with the way that you do things. You've been doing things that way for a really long time, and now the two of you are in conflict about this all the time. The thing that you might use as your hook is that both of you love this farm. You both love farming. You both want the farm to be as productive as possible. Can we work together to figure out how to do that without stepping all over each other's toes? And then what are the likely outcomes to my asking for what I want? And what are the likely outcomes of my getting what I want? Often the other person's idea of what they think the outcome is going to be of your getting what you want impacts the way that they interact with you. If they feel like giving you what you want is going to make them look weak or is going to take something away from them, then they are less likely to give you what you want. So, thing number 2, really listen to what others have to say and let them know that you're listening. We tend not to listen very well as human beings, particularly as human beings in this culture. We tend to nod our heads and not actually be hearing what the other person is saying. We're just waiting for them to take a breath so that we can speak. That is not listening, or at least it's not actively listening, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. I have this little cartoon here because this is a situation where people are hearing what they want to hear. So you have this first person here on the left, and he says, maybe blue would work even better than green. Then you have a second person. He says blue is even better than green. And then you have this person here who says, he says to change it to blue, which is not what he said. The receiver here says, but green tested so much better than blue. She says green is better than blue. She insists on keeping it green. Now, this is sort of like that game we all played when we were kids, telephone, where the message just keeps changing as it moves along. This is why it's really important to be as clear as possible with people about what it is that you think and what it is that you want. And if at all possible, do it directly rather than through intermediaries. So, going back here for a second, when people are really paying attention to you, how do you know? What lets you know that they're actually paying attention? And what are some reasons that you might not give your full attention to a speaker? We tend to apply all sorts of negative connotations to people not paying attention to us or not giving us their full attention. We think it's because they don't care about what it is that we have to say, or they think that they're superior to us, or all sorts of negative things. It may simply be that they're busy, or it's a bad time to try to be talking to them, or they didn't get any sleep last night, or their stomach hurts. It could be all sorts of things, but we don't know that unless we try to ascertain where that's coming from. Think of someone you think is a good communicator, whatever that means to you. I'm not going to define that. What are some things that this person did well? And what were skills that you valued in this person? Those are things, what tends to happen a lot with people who are good communicators is that it has less to do with what comes out of their mouths than their ability to make you feel heard, to make you feel like you have all of their attention. You are the center of their attention right at that moment, even if it's just for a small amount of time, and that they care about what you have to say, and that they've heard you, and they can make you feel like they've heard you. A lot of that comes down to nonverbal communication. And some of these statistics, I know they were surprising to me. They may be surprising to you as well. In a situation where you are communicating with someone, 55%, let me rephrase that, more than half, 55% of what the person is picking up on is your facial expression, your gestures, and your posture. Another almost 40% is the tone of your voice and your inflection. And 7%, only 7% of people's focus is on your words. So it almost doesn't matter what's coming out of your mouth if what people are seeing is something that's turning them off. I will give you a perfect example. In a mediation that I did a while back, it was between a supervisor and someone that worked for them. And the supervisor was talking to the person about how they tend to look like they're not paying attention in meetings and to be very aggressive in the way that they speak to other people, and it makes the supervisor uncomfortable and unwilling to come to them with feedback. Now what this person said back was, well, I really kind of wish you had said something to me about this before. This is the first time I'm hearing this. The next time that we're in a meeting, could you please call to my attention when I do that so that I can fix it? I'd really appreciate that. Now, those words sound great, but when you take into consideration, if I tell you that this person was sitting with their arms crossed, with a very angry-looking facial expression, and their tone of voice went something like this, well, I wish you told me something about this before, because this is the first time I'm hearing about this. Look, here's what we do, okay? Next time we're in a meeting and I do that, can you call that to my attention right then so I can fix it? I'd really appreciate that. So a lot of the time it has less to do with what comes out of your mouth than the way that it comes out of your mouth and the way that your posture and your body says that you feel. Because people can read us and our emotions so much more clearly than we think that they can. So let's talk a little bit about active listening. I talked about this a little bit before, about the difference between sort of passively sitting and hearing people speaking and their words and their things coming out of their mouths, like in this picture here where the guy's going blah, 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 blah. But then there's active listening. Active listening requires us to really hear what the other person is saying. It requires us to acknowledge their feelings, to repeat things back to them, and to clarify what it is that they're trying to get across, to ask exploratory questions, identify what the person wants, respond with empathy when appropriate. If they're saying something that does not require you to be empathetic towards it, then you don't have to respond with empathy, but at least indicate that you understand what they're saying. And to clarify with more neutral, less confrontational language. So, going back to the supervisor and worker that I was just talking about, if the worker had said, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that you feel like I'm really aggressive when you try to give me feedback. Thank you for that. Can you give me a situation where that happened? I'd really like to know what it is that you want me to do with this, because I really do want us to be able to get along well in the workplace, and I don't want us to keep having, you know, situations where we're fighting like this. But I'm sorry if this is something that has been a problem. Now, I did that just off the top of my head, but do you see how that's so different from the way they actually came back at this person? They didn't suggest that what the person had to say was valid in any way. They didn't ask any exploratory questions. They didn't ask for clarification of times maybe that had happened. They didn't even really identify what the person wanted them to do. So that what was likely to happen in that situation, and what did happen in that situation, was the supervisor didn't feel heard and she shut down. Active listening, and the point of active listening is to help to open up the conversation by making the other person feel heard. Now, there are always blocks to active listening. Defensiveness. We all get defensive, particularly if we feel like someone is giving us negative feedback. Bias from your own opinions, beliefs, or experiences. Well, that's not something I've ever seen happen. Ordering. You are going to do this or else there will be consequences. Tends not to go over particularly well. Judging. Do you know what's wrong with you? Or telling someone very specifically what's wrong with them. Threatening. Threatening never works well, except possibly with one's children and only under limited circumstances. And then diagnosing. You know, I really think that you have adult ADHD, like in those commercials, and maybe you need to go get some medication or something, because you just can't focus worth anything. None of these things is going to serve to advance productive communication. All they're going to do is shut things down, which frequently enough is the reason why we use them. We're uncomfortable with the conflict, we're uncomfortable with the discussion, and we don't want to continue with it, and so we put up a block. Doesn't mean that the conflict won't continue and come back. So let's see what we've covered thus far. We've talked about what is conflict, words we associate with conflict, how we can look at conflict differently, styles that we use to deal with conflict, where conflict tends to come from, and the cycle of conflict and where we might be able to intervene. And then we talked about some skills for communicating, nonverbal communication and active listening, and then recognizing our own blocks to active listening. So, moving ahead a little bit, let's talk about some concrete tips to make communicating easier. Thing number one, and this is one that I struggle with myself and that I'm sure a lot of you struggle with. Don't delay difficult conversations. I know it's instinctive. It's completely instinctive. We don't like things that make us uncomfortable, and so we try to stay away from them for as long as possible. It's really not helpful. What does help is to set up or schedule a time to talk, where there's not a lot of other things going on, where neither of you is going to be distracted, where you have let this person know that what I have to say is very important, and so I need 15 minutes of your time, 20 minutes of your time, however much time you feel like you need in order to actually get this across. Before you meet with the person, ask yourself the questions from the last section. What do you want? What do you think they want? How can you go about getting the things that you want in a positive way? Introduce the subject straightforwardly. For example, if you were going to be talking to your children about putting together your estate planning and what you've been thinking about how you want the farm to pass on after you're gone, you might just bring that up in a fairly straightforward but neutral way. For example, your dad and I have been thinking about what we'd like to have happen to the farm after we're gone, and we'd like to hear your ideas. That's straightforward about what it is that you want to talk about, and it also opens it up for the other person or other people to contribute to that conversation. Identify the other person's feelings and values around what it is that you want to talk about. Feelings are things, let's clarify what these are. Feelings are, feelings, anger, happiness, fear, excitement. Values are the sorts of things that we have feelings about. So the things that are important to us: independence, reliability, tradition, flexibility. Those are values. Those are things that we hold close and dear to our hearts that may cause feelings if we feel like those values are being disagreed with or violated in some way. Sort of a higher level form of active listening is reflective listening. And this is something that can be really useful, particularly if you're dealing with someone that you find difficult to communicate with. Someone who tends to be quick to anger, someone who tends to be sort of verbally aggressive, or someone that it's really hard to get anything out of because they're so passive. This type of listening involves two key steps: working to understand a speaker's idea and then offering that idea back to the speaker to confirm that the idea has been understood correctly. And then check in to make sure that you actually have it right. For example, going back to the estate planning example, if you have a child who bursts into tears and says, "I don't know why you want to talk about this, Mom. Are you sick? Is Daddy sick? What's going on? I don't want you to die. You're not going to die. What can I do? I want to help." You might feed that back to them in a way that's a little less emotionally fraught. For example, "I think you're saying that you're sad to think Dad and I won't always be here, and being someone that we can count on is really important to you. Is that right?" Because then what happens is that A, they feel like they've been heard and understood, and B, you are staying calm and neutral, which tends to try to have them try to match where you are, instead of you're going down to match them. Another tip, ask open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are those questions that can't just be answered with a yes or a no. So what they are an open invitation for somebody to start expressing his or her own feelings and their thoughts and their concerns more fully. So you're trying to open the conversation. Think of the difference between, "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" and, "I can't read your face. What do you think about what I just said?" "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" really only has a one-word answer that can come as a response of that. To that, "Yes, I think you're crazy," or "No, of course I don't think you're crazy," and doesn't get you any more information about what the other person does in fact think. And what you really, and you don't actually think that they think you're crazy, you just can't figure out what it is that they're thinking, and you want to know what they're thinking. And so just ask in an open-ended way. So, what did we cover today? We covered what is conflict. We talked about general communication skills that can be useful just in general. And we talked about tips on how to make difficult conversations with potentially difficult people easier on yourself and hopefully a little bit less anxiety-provoking. So what do I hope that you walk away with today? Not all conflict is bad. That's one I have to remember myself. Messages can change. Happens all the time. Listening takes work. Communicating clearly helps in all areas of your life and helps to get you what you want. That's the important part. That second thing helps to get you what you want. Not communicating clearly may keep you out of conflicts that make you uncomfortable, but it won't get you what you want. Figuring out what your conflict management style is can help. And practice, practice, practice. It's really easy to sit and look at a PowerPoint presentation and go, "Wow, those all sound like really cool things," and write them down and then not use them. It happens all the time. You have to practice these skills, preferably in situations where things aren't too emotional and where you aren't too caught up in them to be able to communicate effectively. Practice these skills in your day-to-day life so that they become automatic and you can use them more easily in situations of conflict. Finally, If you have any questions about what I've talked about here today, or you find that you need help communicating about difficult topics that are related to your farm or things having to do with that, you can call us at the Agricultural Conflict Resolution Service. ACRES, isn't that cute? I didn't come up with that one. We handle all sorts of situations that are agriculturally based, so that if you're not sure whether this is something that we can handle, give me a call or shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to talk it through with you. Our services are typically free to our agricultural producers. So the only situation where that's not true is if it's a situation that takes multiple sessions, then there's a fairly nominal cost, and we can talk about that at the time. But I can be reached at 410-841-5778, or you can email me at kmeganwashington1. Please note the 1. If you just type kmeganwashington like that, it won't get to me. So KAY-MEGAN.Washington, like the state, 1, at Maryland, written all the way out, .gov. And I'm typically in the office Monday through Friday from 8 until about 4:30 or 5, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Hopefully this was useful information for you and something that you can find useful in your day-to-day life and use in making your communications, both on a day-to-day basis and in situations that you find difficult, a lot more productive. Thanks so much.